Hi everyone, welcome to Be Like Christ for our Bible study through 1 Kings chapter 2. Just started our 1 Kings study yesterday, so you have time to catch up if you missed chapter 1. That was a long video. These first couple chapters are just like chocked full of information, and it's stuff that I don't feel like I can summarize without mentioning to some degree. So it might be a little bit longer, but this is just because there's a lot. We have so many characters in this chapter, I couldn't even fit them all in the section. So let's go ahead and jump in. The PDF is free on our website at tobelikechrist.com. And let's talk about when these events happened. We're going to talk about the death of David in this chapter, which was briefly mentioned in 1 Chronicles. We're going to talk about it again. David he died in approximately 1015 BC based on the timeline that we're using. Now for our key characters, I've got 7 of them, but really there are even more than this. David, the second king of Israel and Judah. Solomon, who was David's son, who took the throne after him. Do you remember who Solomon's mother was? Bathsheba, right? She's going to come up in this chapter. Adonijah, this was David's 4th son, and he had tried previously in the last chapter to claim the throne for himself to replace his father, but David wanted Solomon to do that job. Joab, the commander of David's army. Shimei, years earlier, Shimei had mocked David and thrown stones at him during the rebellion of Absalom. That's going to come up again. Abiathar, he was a priest who served David in Jerusalem. He supported Adonijah's claim to the throne in the last chapter, and that's going to get him in some trouble with Solomon in this chapter. And then Benaiah. Benaiah was one of David's mighty men in charge of his bodyguard. Benaiah took over as commander of the army after Joab. We're going to be spending most of our time in Jerusalem in this chapter. This was the nation of Israel and Judah's religious and civil center. That takes us over to page number 2 and our outline section. Section number 1, verses 1 through 9. David gives Solomon instructions before his death. So when David was about to die, he called Solomon to him to give him some instructions, and he told him that he needed to follow the commands of the Lord if he wanted the nation to prosper. Then David did something interesting. He brought up some grievances that he had with a few men in his kingdom, namely 2 of them. The first one was Joab. He actually wanted Joab, the commander of his army for years and years and years, who, to be fair, he had plenty of quarrels with during his time. He wanted Joab to be killed. And the reason is because Joab had previously killed 2 of David's allies, Abner and Amasa, if you remember those guys. David also wanted Shimei to be punished. Shimei, as we just mentioned, he was a guy who disrespected David as Absalom ran him out of Jerusalem during Absalom's rebellion. And then in very Bible-like fashion, very Old Testament-like fashion, we have the death of David recorded in verses 10 and 11, just 2 verses. We'll come back to this in our application. David died, and he was buried in Jerusalem. If you remember from the Gospels, Jesus actually makes mention of David's tomb being in Jerusalem. David reigned for 40 years, 7.5 years in Judah, and then 33 years over both Israel and Judah. So hopefully you remember from last chapter about Adonijah's claim to the throne and how David and Bathsheba and Solomon and Nathan the prophet thwarted that to put Solomon on the throne. That's going to come up here again in verses 12 through 25. Solomon this time kills Adonijah, because you remember, he showed him mercy originally, but now he's going to kill him, and here's why. One day, Adonijah went to Bathsheba, and he asked Bathsheba, who was Solomon's mother, to go to Solomon and to convince Solomon, basically, to give Adonijah Abishag to be his wife. Abishag, remember, was the young woman from the last chapter who served David by keeping him warm. Now, Bathsheba thought this was an okay request. She went to her son Solomon, and when she proposed that Abishag be given to Adonijah, Solomon became very angry. He interpreted Adonijah's request as an attack. And this was probably because of Abishag's closeness and connection to King David, paired with Adonijah's previous ambition to take the throne. So he's like, what is Adonijah up to? This time, Solomon wasn't going to he wasn't going to tolerate it. He ordered Benaiah, one of David's mighty men, to put Adonijah to death. There's a lot of bloodshed in this chapter, and I suppose that was probably pretty common whenever there was a change of power on the throne, people wrestling and jockeying for positioning in the new kingdom. We're going to talk about some more bloodshed in our last section, verses 26 through 46. Solomon purges Israel of his father's enemies. So after killing his brother, Solomon banished Abiathar, who was that priest who had previously sided with Adonijah when he was trying to claim the throne. So he said, Abiathar, since you sided with my brother, my enemy, my rival, you're kicked out of here. So he's banished. Now, this order came from Solomon. It was him who decided to do it. But it was directed by the providence of God, we find out. When Abiathar was banished from Jerusalem and therefore wasn't able to serve as a priest any longer, it fulfilled a prophecy that had been spoken against the priestly house of Eli as a punishment on Eli's house because of the wickedness of his sons. That was about 100 years previous to this. If you want to know more about that, read 1 Samuel 2, verses 30 through 33. So next, Solomon turned his attention to Joab. Joab had also allied with Adonijah. So David had beef with him. Solomon kind of has some beef with him. When Joab learned that Solomon was after him, he went to the tabernacle and he took hold of the altar that was there in that sacred place. Seems like he was hoping to find sanctuary there, but it didn't work out for him. After getting permission from Solomon, Benaiah went into the tabernacle and killed Joab. So this era of David and Joab is at an end at this point, and we're moving on. Next, Solomon went after this last guy, Shimei. Now, he didn't initially put Shimei to death. Instead, he put him under house arrest in Jerusalem. But 3 years later, Shimei broke the conditions of his house arrest, and Solomon had him put to death. So we see here the strengthening of Solomon's throne, and that's only going to get stronger and stronger as we go into the next couple chapters. So that will take us into our application section. You remember, I wanted to take it from verses 10 and 11, those verses about David's death. This chapter illustrates the point that the story that's recorded in the Bible, God's story, is primarily about him and what he's doing. It's not about us. David is one of the most significant individuals in the Old Testament, right? The books and books that record the details of his life. But his death doesn't stop the story. You notice that. We just keep on cruising into 1 Kings. In fact, his death is documented in extraordinary brevity, which we mentioned, only 2 verses, verses 10 and 11, and then the story continues on. Isn't that kind of humbling? I think it is. To know that no matter how significant we are during our lifetime, eventually we're going to die, and God's story is going to continue. It's not about us. That's incredibly humbling in a sense, but also it should make us feel privileged that God would use us as a piece, no matter how small of a piece, in this great eternal story that he's telling.